I stood in the grand hallway of the Montgomery mansion, the same place where I once scrubbed floors and polished silver until my hands ached. Mrs. Montgomery's voice was sharp, almost trembling. "You'll have to leave by tonight, Elena. We've sold the mansion." Her daughter Sasha leaned against the staircase, smirking like she'd just won a game. "It's nothing personal," she said, "but you don't belong here anymore." I looked around at the high ceilings, the crystal chandelier, the marble floors. Every corner held a memory, some bitter, some sweet. I smiled, not the kind of smile they were used to seeing from me. This one was calm, steady, dangerous. "That's fine," I said softly. "I already own it." The room went silent. Sasha's smirk faded. Mrs. Montgomery's eyes widened. They didn't know. They couldn't have guessed. I walked past them, my heels clicking against the marble, and placed my hand on the banister, the same one I used to dust every morning. "This house," I said, "is mine now. And so is everything you thought you could take from me." I didn't wait for their reply. I had waited long enough. I wasn't always the woman who could walk into the Montgomery mansion and claim it as my own. Not long ago, I was just the maid. Back then, my days started before sunrise. I'd walk up the long driveway, the morning air still cold, and unlock the side door that led straight into the kitchen. The smell of coffee brewing was the only comfort before the chaos began. Mrs. Montgomery liked things perfect, not clean. Perfect. If a glass wasn't lined up exactly with the others, she'd notice. If the silverware didn't shine, she'd sigh loudly, as if my very existence was a disappointment. Her daughter, Sasha, was worse. She was in her mid-20s, beautiful, in a sharp, polished way, but her beauty came with a cruel edge. She'd leave her clothes scattered across the floor and then laugh when I bent to pick them up. "Careful, Elena," she'd say. "Don't wrinkle it. It costs more than your monthly pay." Derek, the son, was charming on the surface. He'd flash a smile, ask about my day, even offer me a drink when no one was looking. But I learned quickly that his kindness was a game. He liked to see how far he could push boundaries, how close he could get before I pulled away. The mansion itself was like something out of a magazine: high ceilings, marble floors, a chandelier that sparkled like ice. But to me, it was a cage. Every room reminded me of my place, invisible, replaceable, unimportant. Still, I did my job. I kept my head down. I listened more than I spoke. And in listening, I learned things. I learned that the Montgomery family's wealth wasn't as solid as it looked. Mr. Montgomery's business had been struggling for years. They were living on reputation and credit. I also learned that Mrs. Montgomery had a habit of making enemies, former friends, business partners, even relatives. And then there was the secret I carried. One I never spoke aloud. Mr. Montgomery was my father. My mother had worked for the family years before I was born. She and Mr. Montgomery had a brief relationship, one that ended the moment Mrs. Montgomery found out. My mother left, pregnant and alone, and raised me without a single penny from him. When my mother passed away, I needed work. The mansion was hiring. I took the job, knowing exactly who they were, and knowing they had no idea who I was. It wasn't revenge I wanted at first. I told myself I just needed the paycheck. But every insult, every smirk, every time they treated me like I was less than human, it built something inside me. Something sharp. There were small moments that stuck with me. Like the time Sasha spilled red wine on the carpet and blamed me for not watching where I was going. Or when Mrs. Montgomery told a guest, right in front of me, "Good help is hard to find these days." I swallowed it all. I smiled when I had to. I stayed quiet when I wanted to scream. Because I knew that patience was a kind of power. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon. The house was buzzing with preparations for a dinner party. I was polishing the silver in the dining room when Mrs. Montgomery stormed in, holding an empty jewelry box. "Elena," she said, her voice cold, "where is my diamond necklace?" I froze. "I haven't seen it, ma'am." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. You're the only one who's been in here today." Before I could speak again, Sasha walked in, arms crossed. "I told you she was too quiet. People like her always have something to hide." They didn't call the police, not yet. But they made sure every guest that night knew I was a thief. By morning, I was fired. No reference, no severance, just a warning that they'd make sure no one else hired me. I left the mansion that day with nothing but my bag and my pride. But as I walked down that long driveway for the last time, I made myself a promise. They had taken my job, my reputation, and tried to crush my dignity. I would take everything from them in return. The day they broke me wasn't loud. It wasn't a screaming match or a dramatic scene in front of strangers. It was quieter than that, and somehow, that made it worse. It started with Mrs. Montgomery calling me into the sitting room. She was standing by the fireplace, holding an empty velvet jewelry box in her hands. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. "Elena," she said, "my diamond necklace is missing." I blinked. "I haven't seen it, ma'am." Her eyes narrowed. "You're the only one who's been in my room today." Before I could answer, Sasha walked in. She didn't even look at me, she looked at her mother. "I told you she was too quiet. People like her always have something to hide." I felt my stomach twist. "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice shaking. Mrs. Montgomery sighed, as if she were tired of the conversation already. "We'll give you until the end of the day to return it. If you don't, we'll have no choice but to involve the police." The words hit me like a slap. I had worked in that house for years. I had cleaned their floors, cooked their meals, kept their secrets. And now, without a shred of proof, they were ready to throw me to the wolves. I went back to the kitchen, my hands trembling. The other staff avoided my eyes. Word had already spread. By dinner, I could feel the stares from the guests. Whispers followed me from room to room. That night, Mrs. Montgomery made sure to humiliate me in front of everyone. She stood at the head of the long dining table, her voice carrying over the clink of silverware. "It's such a shame," she said, "when people you trust turn out to be dishonest." Sasha smirked at me from across the table. Derek just looked away. By morning, it was over. Mrs. Montgomery handed me an envelope with my last paycheck. "No reference, no apology. We'll be in touch if we find the necklace," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe we would. I walked out of the mansion with my head high. But inside, I was burning. They thought they could ruin me. They thought I'd disappear, quietly. Just another nameless maid they could replace. But they didn't know who I really was. As I walked down that long driveway, I thought of my mother, how she had left this same house years ago, pregnant and alone, after Mrs. Montgomery forced her out. I thought of the nights she worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I thought of the way she'd told me, "Patience, Elena, the world has a way of turning." I didn't have the necklace, but I had something far more dangerous. The truth. I was Mr. Montgomery's daughter. His blood ran in my veins, whether they liked it or not. And now that he was gone, there was nothing stopping me from taking back what should have been mine all along. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this: I would not beg, I would not cry, I would not forget they had taken my job, my reputation, and tried to crush my dignity. I would take everything from them in return. And when I did, I wouldn't just take their money or their house, I would take their pride. I would make them feel small in the very rooms where they once made me feel invisible. That was the day Elena the maid died, and Elena the avenger was born. The first weeks after I left the mansion were the hardest. No job. No references. No one willing to hire the maid who stole from her employer. I rented a small room above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread in the mornings was the only comfort I had. I spent my days looking for work and my nights thinking about the Montgomerys. At first, I thought about clearing my name. Maybe I could find proof I didn't take the necklace. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want their apology. I wanted their downfall. I still had my mother's small inheritance. She had worked her whole life to save it for me. I could have used it to live quietly. But something in me refused to fade away. I enrolled in evening classes, business, finance, and law. I worked part-time cleaning offices, saving every extra penny. I learned how companies worked, how debts were bought and sold, how power moved quietly behind the scenes. It wasn't glamorous. I ate cheap meals, wore the same coat for 3 winters, and studied until my eyes ached. But every late night, every sacrifice, was fuel for the fire inside me. 2 years passed. I had a degree, a small consulting business, and a growing list of contacts. I learned to speak their language, the language of contracts, investments, and leverage. One day, while reviewing a client's portfolio, I saw a familiar name, Montgomery Holdings. My pulse quickened. I dug deeper. The company was drowning in debt, their mansion was mortgaged, their businesses were bleeding money. It was the opening I had been waiting for. I started small. I bought a tiny share in one of their struggling suppliers. Then another. I made friends with people they owed money to. I learned which banks held their loans. I never used my real name. On paper, I was just another investor. In reality, I was building a web one thread at a time around the Montgomery empire. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on them. Sasha's fashion brand was failing. Derek had been caught in a scandal involving a fake charity. Mrs. Montgomery was selling off jewelry and art to keep up appearances. I didn't rush. Revenge, I had learned, was like cooking a perfect meal. It needed time, patience, and the right ingredients. 3 more years passed. By then, I controlled enough of their debt to influence decisions. I had allies in their boardrooms. I knew which of their friends would turn on them for the right price, and then the moment came. A bank put the mansion up for foreclosure. The Montgomerys were desperate to find a buyer who would let them stay. I made my offer through a holding company. They never knew it was me. When the deal closed, I stood in the empty grand hallway, the keys in my hand, the same hallway where Mrs. Montgomery had once told me I didn't belong. I ran my fingers along the banister I used to dust. I looked up at the chandelier I used to clean. And I smiled. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Owning the house was just the stage. The real performance, the one they would never forget, was still to come. Owning the mansion was just the beginning. I didn't want them to simply lose their home. I wanted them to feel the slow, creeping fear of watching their world fall apart piece by piece. The first move was Sasha. Her fashion brand was already hanging by a thread. I knew her suppliers, her investors, and her dirty little secret: she'd been using cheap fabrics while charging luxury prices. Through a contact, I leaked photos of her Italian silk dresses being made in a warehouse overseas. The story spread online like wildfire. Orders were cancelled. Influencers dropped her brand overnight. Next was Derek. He had always been reckless with money, but now he was desperate. I had someone pose as a potential investor for one of his charity projects. The moment he took the bait and moved funds into his personal account, the evidence was sent to the right people. Within weeks, he was under investigation for fraud. His charm couldn't save him this time. Mrs. Montgomery was harder. She had built her life on control of her image, her family, her social circle. I took that from her. I bought the mortgage on the mansion through a shell company. Then I called in the debt. She tried to negotiate, but the terms were clear: pay in full or vacate. She didn't know it was me. Not yet. The day the foreclosure notice arrived, I made sure the local paper covered it. Prominent family loses historic estate. Her friends stopped calling. Invitations stopped coming. The woman who once looked down on everyone was now the subject of whispered pity. I let them stew in it for weeks. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in. Finally, I set the stage for the reveal. I invited them to the mansion under the pretense of a potential buyer who might let them stay on as tenants. They arrived looking smaller somehow. Sasha in a plain dress. Derek avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Montgomery clutching her handbag like it was the last thing she owned. They were led into the grand hallway. I stepped out from the shadows. Elena. Mrs. Montgomery's voice was sharp, but there was something else in it now: uncertainty. I smiled. Welcome home. Sasha's eyes darted around. What is this? Why are you here? I live here, I said simply. In fact, I own this place now. The silence that followed was almost sweet. Mrs. Montgomery's face went pale. You bought the house. Yes, and the land. And the debts you've been drowning in. I took a step closer. You remember the necklace you accused me of stealing? I never took it. But you took something from me. My job, my name, my dignity. I decided to take something back. Sasha's voice cracked. You ruined us. I shook my head. No, you ruined yourselves. I just helped the process along. I walked them through the house, pointing out the rooms I used to clean, the corners where they'd once ignored me. This banister, I said, running my hand along it. I used to polish it every morning. Now it's mine. When we reached the front door, I turned to them. I'm not throwing you out on the street. I'm offering you jobs. My foundation helps people who've been mistreated by their employers. You can work there, cleaning, filing, whatever you're qualified for. You'll be paid fairly, but you'll answer to me. Mrs. Montgomery's lips trembled. You expect us to work for you. I expect you to decide what's more important, your pride or your survival. They didn't answer. They just stood there, 3 people who had once thought they were untouchable, now stripped of everything but the clothes on their backs. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The look in their eyes was enough. As they left, I stood in the doorway, watching. Them walk down the same driveway I had walked years ago. Back then, I had nothing. Now, I had everything. And I had done it without raising my voice, without breaking a single law. Revenge, I realized, didn't have to be loud. Sometimes, it was quiet, precise, velvet, soft, and unforgettable. They came back the next morning. Not to fight, not to demand, but to talk. Mrs. Montgomery stood at the front door, her posture still straight, but her eyes, they were tired. Sasha hovered behind her, arms crossed, but without the usual smirk. Derek kept his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. I let them in. The air inside the mansion was different now, quieter, heavier. We sat in the same sitting room where she had once accused me of theft. I didn't offer them tea. I didn't need to pretend anymore. Mrs. Montgomery spoke first. We've discussed your offer. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. We'll take the jobs. Sasha's jaw tightened. We don't have a choice. I nodded slowly. You do have a choice. You can walk away with nothing. Or you can work, earn, and rebuild, the same way I had too. Derek finally looked up. Why are you doing this? You could have just thrown us out. I leaned back in my chair. Because I'm not you, I don't destroy people for sport. I give them a chance to see what it feels like to start from the bottom. Silence filled the room. I could see the weight of my words settling on them. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway. Years ago, I walked down that path with nothing but a bag and my pride. You watched me go, certain you'd never see me again, but here I am, and here you are. Mrs. Montgomery's voice cracked. We were wrong about you. I turned to face them. No, you knew exactly who I was, someone you thought you could step on without consequence. You just didn't know. I'd rise higher than you ever imagined. Sasha's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. Derek said nothing. I walked them to the door. Your first day is Monday. Don't be late. They stepped outside, and for a moment, I saw them as they truly were, not the powerful Montgomerys, but three people stripped of their armor, facing a world they no longer controlled. As they walked down the driveway, I felt no guilt, no regret. This wasn't cruelty. This was balance. I closed the door behind them and let the silence settle. The mansion was mine now, not just the walls and the furniture, but the history, the power, the story. And I knew this was the chapter they would never forget. They came back the next morning. Not to fight, not to demand, but to talk. Mrs. Montgomery stood at the front door, her posture still straight, but her eyes, they were tired. Sasha hovered behind her, arms crossed, but without the usual smirk. Derek kept his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. I let them in. The air inside the mansion was different now, quieter, heavier. We sat in the same sitting room where she had once accused me of theft. I didn't offer them tea. I didn't need to pretend anymore. Mrs. Montgomery spoke first. We've discussed your offer. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. We'll take the jobs. Sasha's jaw tightened. We don't have a choice. I nodded slowly. You do have a choice. You can walk away with nothing. Or you can work, earn, and rebuild, the same way I had too. Derek finally looked up. Why are you doing this? You could have just thrown us out. I leaned back in my chair. Because I'm not you, I don't destroy people for sport. I give them a chance to see what it feels like to start from the bottom. Silence filled the room. I could see the weight of my words settling on them. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway. Years ago, I walked down that path with nothing but a bag and my pride. You watched me go, certain you'd never see me again, but here I am, and here you are. Mrs. Montgomery's voice cracked. We were wrong about you. I turned to face them. No, you knew exactly who I was, someone you thought you could step on without consequence. You just didn't know. I'd rise higher than you ever imagined. Sasha's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away. Derek said nothing. I walked them to the door. Your first day is Monday. Don't be late. They stepped outside, and for a moment, I saw them as they truly were, not the powerful Montgomerys, but three people stripped of their armor, facing a world they no longer controlled. As they walked down the driveway, I felt no guilt, no regret. This wasn't cruelty. This was balance. I closed the door behind them and let the silence settle. The mansion was mine now, not just the walls and the furniture, but the history, the power, the story. And I knew this was the chapter they would never forget.